Wherever you are right now, I hope you're warm. Whether you found your way here in the dead of night or in the quiet of a slow afternoon, letting this play in the background while you work or cook or simply rest. This is an invitation to make yourself comfortable and join me as we uncover the entire story of the last ice age. A frozen world, a long winter, and how we made it through. This is Midnight Sapien, a quiet space for minds that are still wondering, still listening, long after the rest of the world has gone silent. I often wonder where this story is being heard. What time is it for you right now as you listen to a story from a time before clocks? If you feel like sharing, I'd love to know in the comments. It is a quiet reminder that we are all listening to this story together. Here we tell the entire story of us, not with speed, but with stillness. So go ahead, dim the lights. Turn down the brightness on your screen. Let the noise of the modern world fade just for a little while. You don't need to memorize the dates. You don't need to take notes. You only need to be here because tonight we are going somewhere cold. A world before shelter was a guarantee. A time when warmth wasn't a setting on a thermostat, but the fragile difference between life and death. This is the entire story of the last great ice age. The story of a frozen planet and the small, warm-blooded creatures who learned to survive it. If this kind of slow, deep storytelling brings you a little bit of calm or a little bit of wonder, consider liking the video and subscribing. That small click isn't just for an algorithm. It helps other quiet minds out there find this space, a signal that slow, thoughtful science still has a home here. What we do is soft science. We don't have all the answers because the ice keeps many of its secrets, but we honor the facts we do have, and we wonder about the rest together. And as always, if the story carries you into sleep at some point tonight, that's perfectly okay. I've left chapters in the description below so you can always find your place again when you return, because this is a story about endurance. It can wait for you. Now, let's step into the cold. It did not begin with a storm. There was no single day when the sky cracked open and the world froze over. There was no great cataclysm, no final dramatic winter that arrived like a thief in the night. It was quieter than that, slower, almost gentle in its devastation. A change so gradual that a person could live their entire life and never know that their world was ending. It began with a summer that was just a little less warm than the one before. A patch of snow on a northern mountain that did not melt in August. A river that froze a week earlier than anyone could remember. The air, even in the brightest daylight, seemed to carry a new kind of chill, a thin, sharp bite that the fire could not quite soften. A quality of light that seemed less gold, more silver. No one noticed at first. How could they? Human memory even then was measured in seasons, not in millennia. The stories of the elders went back only a few generations. Tales of great hunts and dry seasons now passed, and in that short span of time, the world was still the world. The sun still rose. The herd still moved. But the planet has a different kind of memory, a deeper rhythm written in the slow wobble of its axis, the gentle stretch of its orbit around the sun. These are the melancholic cycles, the quiet cosmic metronome that has governed Earth's climate for eons. They are not a single force, but three silent overlapping breaths that the Earth takes over vast stretches of time. First, there is the shape of Earth's path around the sun, its eccentricity. Over 100,000 years, it shifts from a near-perfect circle to a mild ellipse and back again. When the orbit is more elliptical, the Earth spends more time farther from the sun. The warmth becomes less reliable. This is the longest, slowest breath, a pulse of distant cosmic influence. Then there is the tilt of our planet's axis, its omnipresence. Over 41,000 years it rocks back and forth by just a few degrees. A greater tilt means more extreme seasons, hotter summers capable of melting the previous winter's ice. A lesser tilt means something milder, a world of gentler contrasts, where the summer sun is too weak to undo the work of the winter cold. And finally, there is the wobble, the precession. Like a spinning top slowing down, the Earth's axis traces a slow circle in the sky. This changes which hemisphere is pointed toward the sun during the planet's closest approach. It determines which pole gets the harshest winter and which receives the weakest summer. Individually, these changes are small, almost meaningless. A tiny shift in solar radiation, a slight cooling of the sea. But sometimes through the slow, patient dance of orbital mechanics, they align, their rhythms converge. The long, slow exhale of all three cycles happens at once. And when they do, the world changes. Around 115,000 years ago, they began to align against warmth. The orbit stretched slightly. The tilt lessened and the northern summers grew weak. Year after year, the winter snows in the north arrived a little earlier and lingered a little longer. The snow that fell on the highlands of Scandinavia, on the great plains of what is now Canada, on the mountains of Siberia stopped melting completely. At first, it was just a dusting that survived the summer in the shadow of a mountain. Then a field of white that stayed through the autumn. Then a permanent sheet of ice, a vast glittering mirror reflecting the weak sun's light back into space, making the world just a little colder still. And so the feedback loop began. Colder summers meant more snow survived. More snow meant more sunlight was reflected away from the earth. More reflection meant even colder summers. Slowly, imperceptibly, the ice began to grow, under the pressure of its own impossible weight. The frozen snow compacted. The delicate flakes were crushed into granular ice, then into dense blue crystal, and then it began to move. A glacier is not a static thing. It is a river of ice, a slow-motion catastrophe. And it has a sound, a deep groaning groan from within its core, the sound of rock being pulverized, a sharp crack that echoes for miles across the silent landscape as a fissure opens in its heart, and a great thunderous roar as a cliff of ice collapses into the sea, an act of carving that gives birth to icebergs the size of mountains. It grinds forward with a force that turns granite into flour. It carves U-shaped valleys from mountainsides. It carries boulders the size of houses for thousands of kilometers and drops them in silent fields where they do not belong. Lonely monuments to a power no human could comprehend. And for thousands of years the glaciers grew. The Laurentide ice sheet rose over North America, eventually burying cities like Chicago and Toronto under 3 kilometers of solid ice. The Scandinavian ice sheet began its slow, relentless crawl across Europe, crushing forests, rooting rivers, and scraping the land down to bedrock. They were not just sheets of ice. They were weather machines, their sheer mass altering the wind patterns of the entire planet. As the glaciers grew, they drank the oceans. Every snowflake that fell in the north and did not melt was a drop of water taken from the sea and locked away on land. The sea levels began to fall meter by meter, century by century. The coastlines of the world retreated. The oceans shrank. Great plains of the continental shelf, drowned for millennia, were exposed to the cold sun for the first time. A new lost world emerged from the water. In Europe, a green country of winding rivers and gentle hills rose from the North Sea, connecting Britain to the mainland. We call it Doggerland, a forgotten Atlantis, not of myth, but of ice. In Asia, a cold, wind-swept bridge of grassland appeared between Siberia and Alaska, a highway for giant beasts. We call it Bingia, a strange temporary homeland built on the floor of a vanished ocean. Australia and New Guinea fused into a single giant continent called Sahul. The world our ancestors had known was vanishing. The beaches where they had gathered shellfish were now miles inland. The river mouths where they had fished were now deep valleys. But in its place a new, stranger world was being born. The winds that blew off the great ice sheets were cold and they were dry. They picked up the fine dust from the ground-up rock of the glaciers and carried it across the continents in great grey clouds. This dust, called loess, settled in thick blankets, burying old landscapes and creating new fertile soils that would one day feed the world. But for now it was just dust, a constant presence, a fine gritty powder in the air, in the water, in the food, in the lungs. The familiar patterns of rain shifted. The monsoons of Africa and Asia weakened. Forests that had thrived for generations began to wither. In the north, they were simply bulldozed by the advancing ice. Further south, they starved for rain. The great dense woodlands of Europe became sparse stands of pine and birch, and then nothing but frozen tundra. The very trees seemed to cry out as the permafrost heaved beneath them. They tilted at strange angles, becoming what botanists call drunken forests, a landscape staggering under the weight of the cold. This was not a single challenge to overcome. It was a complete rewriting of the rules of survival, and perhaps the rules of the cosmos itself. Imagine what it felt like. You are a hunter, a gatherer, a person whose entire world is held in memory. The memory of where to find water in the dry season. The memory of a trail that leads to the best berry bushes. The memory of a story your grandfather told you about the river that always runs and the great tree that marks the place where the ancestors are buried. But now that memory is a lie. The river where your grandparents fished is now a shallow frozen stream, its banks choked with strange hardy mosses. The forest where you gathered nuts is now a field of cold, hissing grass that cuts your hands. The animals you once hunted have moved south, or they have vanished entirely, replaced by massive, shaggy creatures you have no name for. The great tree of the ancestors is gone, pushed over by ice 1,000 years before you were born. The mental maps of the world passed down for generations were now useless. The old stories no longer match the land. What happens to a people when their stories stop being true? When the sacred places are gone? When the wisdom of the elders can no longer predict the coming of the rain? This was more than an ecological crisis. It was a crisis of meaning. The world was no longer predictable. The spirits were silent. The sun itself seemed to be dying, a distant pale disk in a hazy, dust-filled sky. For the small bands of humans living through this, the world must have felt like it was betraying them. They did not have the language of climatology. They did not know about orbital mechanics. They only knew that the world was growing harder, that the nights were longer, and that the cold was a living thing, and still the ice crept forward. The humans living at its edge would have felt it first. The air near the great sheets was different, colder of course, but also thinner somehow, and strangely sterile. It carried the smell of something ancient, something that had never been alive. They would have watched the glaciers from the hills, a shimmering unnatural wall of blue and white on the distant horizon, a mountain that moved, a mountain that ate the world. They would have told stories about it, tried to understand it. Perhaps the ice was a great white beast sleeping. Perhaps it was the frozen breath of a sky god. Perhaps they made offerings to it. A piece of carved antler, a sprinkle of red ochre, a silent promise. Perhaps. They simply learned to fear it and to stay away, always moving south, away from its grinding, groaning presence. The old world of our ancestors, the familiar temperate world of the first Homo sapiens was being buried, sealed beneath a slow-moving tomb of ice. The places where they had been born, the caves they had sheltered in were swallowed, and with them their memories, their art, their bones erased. But the ice did not just destroy. It also created in the place of the temperate forests and warm savas. It forged a new biome, a world that had never existed before in this form. A vast, cold and surprisingly rich grassland that would stretch from Spain across the heart of Asia all the way to the Yukon. A world ruled by giants, a world of wind, dust and grass, the world of the Mammoth Steppe, and the small, clever apes who had watched their world freeze now had to learn to live in it. They could no longer rely on the old ways. The gentle foraging of the woodlands was gone. The easy hunting of the savas was gone. This new world demanded a new kind of human, a new kind of mind, one who could endure the cold, one who could follow the great herds across a landscape without landmarks, one who could find a way to make a home in a world that felt like it had no home left in it. They would have to learn new ways to hunt, new ways to stay warm, new ways to remember. Because in a world without summer, memory is the only fire that can last. And the story of that fire and the giants that walked beside it is where we are going next. It is a world we can no longer see. A landscape that exists now only in frozen bones, in scraps of ancient pollen, and in the faint genetic echo of the creatures who walked it. It was not a forest, and it was not a desert of ice. It was something in between, something stranger. A vast, cold, and dusty grassland that stretched almost unbroken from the shores of the Atlantic in Spain to the frozen coast of Siberia and across the Bering Land Bridge, into the heart of Alaska. This was the Mammoth Steppe, the largest single biome that has ever existed on Earth. And for 100,000 years it was the center of the world. To picture it, you must forget the landscapes you know. Forget the deep, lush grasses of a modern prairie. Forget the dense, dark forests of a temperate world. The Mammoth Steppe was different. It was a world of cold, dry air. The great ice sheets to the north locked away the planet's moisture, and the winds that blew off them were relentless and parched. There was not enough rain for great trees to grow. So the world was open, exposed to a vast pale sky. The ground was a mosaic of hardy grasses, sedges, and low-growing flowering herbs. Plants adapted not just to the cold, but to the constant grazing of giant mouths. In the brief, intense summers under a sun that never fully set, this world would have exploded in a carpet of tough, resilient color. But for most of the year, it was a panorama of brown, gray, and ochre, dusted with frost or a thin layer of snow. And across this immense open landscape the giants moved. This was not a world of small, scurrying creatures hiding in the undergrowth. This was an age of titans. The megapora first and most iconic were the mammoths, the great woolly mammoths, Mammoth primogenius. They were not just elephants with fur. They were creatures engineered by the cold, standing 3 meters tall at the shoulder, covered in a thick, shaggy coat of dark hair over a dense, woolly undercoat for insulation. Their ears were small to minimize heat loss. A large hump of fat on their backs served as an energy reserve for the long winters, and their tusks, great curving sides of ivory that could grow up to 5 meters long. They were not just for defense. The mammoths used them as snowplows, sweeping aside the winter drifts to uncover the frozen grasses buried beneath. To stand before a herd of them, to hear the deep rumbling calls that vibrated through the frozen ground, to feel the earth shake under the weight of their slow, deliberate footsteps would have been to witness a force of nature, a living, breathing mountain range on the move. They were the architects of this landscape. Their grazing kept the trees from taking root, maintaining the open grassland that they and so many other creatures depended on. And they were not alone. Beside them walked the woolly rhinoceros, Colodonte antiquitatis, a creature of immense power, shorter than a mammoth, but built like a battering ram. Its body was low to the ground, covered in the same thick, shaggy fur. But its head carried something different. Not tusks of ivory, but 2 great horns of keratin rising from its snout. The front horn, flattened like a massive blade, could grow a meter long. Like the mammoths, it used this horn to sweep away snow, to dig for frozen roots, to clear a path through the frozen world. It was a solitary, grumpy animal, a tank of muscle and instinct that feared very little. And there were the grazers who lived in their shadow. Vast herds of bison, the great steppe bison, larger and shaggier than their modern cousins, their breath pluming in the cold air. Wild horses smaller and stockier than today's breeds with thick coats and a stubborn endurance. And the reindeer or caribou creatures perfectly adapted to this world, their wide, splintered hooves acting as natural snowshoes, allowing them to walk across drifts that would swallow any other animal. These herds were the pulse of the steppe. Their migrations, driven by the slow, predictable shift of the seasons, were the rhythm of life. They were the great, moving rivers of meat and fat and bone that flowed across the frozen plains, the promise of survival for anything clever enough to catch them. And there were things that hunted them. The cave lion Panthetheropala. It was not a true lion, and it did not live only in caves. It was a giant predator, 25% larger than a modern African lion, the apex hunter of the Ice Age steppe. It was built for ambush and overwhelming power. We know what they look like from the art our ancestors left behind. No man on the males, just a sleek, powerful body, perhaps with faint tiger-like stripes for camouflage against the dry grass. They hunted bison, horses, young mammoths. To hear its roar echo across a frozen valley at dusk would have been to know a kind of fear we can no longer imagine. There were the hyenas, the giant cave hyenas, also larger than their modern relatives, their powerful jaws capable of cracking mammoth bone to get at the marrow inside. They were not just scavengers, they were pack hunters, intelligent and relentless. And there were the wolves, the great dire wolves of the Pleistocene, packs of them moving like grey ghosts through the twilight, their eyes shining in the cold. This was the world, a brutal, beautiful, and utterly unsentimental ecosystem, a food web built on a foundation of frozen grass and ending in the teeth of a giant cat. It was a world, immense scale of constant, slow-moving drama. It was a world of silence, broken by the cry of a wolf, the rumble of a mammoth, or the sound of the wind. And into this world walked a small, clever ape. For the first humans who stepped onto the Mammoth Steppe, it must have felt like landing on another planet. They were a tropical species built for warmth and sun. Their bodies were long and slender, designed to shed heat, not preserve it. They had no claws, no great horns, no thick, shaggy fur. They had only their minds, their hands, and the small, flickering memory of fire. To survive here was not just a matter of enduring the cold. It was about learning a new language, the language of a landscape that gave away its secrets reluctantly. The ground itself was a new kind of challenge, permafrost. Soil that had been frozen solid for thousands of years lay just beneath the surface. In the brief summer, the top layer would thaw into a muddy, unstable bog. Rivers would swell with meltwater, their banks collapsing. In the winter, the ground would heave and crack with the force of the frost, a process that could split rock and tilt entire hillsides. There were no easy shelters here. The sparse trees offered little protection. Caves were rare and often already occupied by bears or lions. To live here, you had to bring your shelter with you or build it from the bones of the giants you hunted. The rules of this world were simple and they were absolute. Everything was about energy. Every calorie consumed was precious. Every calorie spent had to be worth the cost. A failed hunt was not just a missed meal. It could be a death sentence, an injury, a broken leg. A deep gash from a bison's horn meant being left behind to the wolves in the cold. There was no room for error. There was no margin for sentiment. And yet, this brutal landscape was also a place of strange abundance. Unlike a dense forest where prey is hidden and scattered, the open steppe was a world of immense visibility. From the top of a small rise, a hunter could see for kilometers. They could watch the slow, predictable movements of the great herds. They could see the dust clouds of their migrations from a day's walk away. They could plan, and the cold itself was a form of preservation. A mammoth killed at the beginning of winter was not just a single feast. It was a lard of frozen meat that could sustain a family for months. The permafrost was a natural freezer. A cache of meat buried in the frozen ground would be safe from scavengers and rot waiting to be retrieved in the leanest months. This was the great paradox of the Mammoth Steppe. It was one of the harshest environments on Earth and also one of the richest. It was a world that would kill you in a moment if you lost your focus, but would feed you for a year if you understood its rhythms. And so our ancestors learned. They learned to read the subtle signs of this new world, the way the wind shaped the snowdrifts, revealing which direction offered shelter. The way the mosses grew on the rocks, indicating where the sun was strongest. They learned to track animals not just by their footprints, but by the frozen droppings they left behind, the broken twigs on the low-lying shrubs. They became part of this ecosystem. Not as its masters, not yet, but as a new, dangerously intelligent predator, a creature that hunted not with speed or strength, but with foresight. A creature that could imagine where the mammoth would be tomorrow and be waiting there. A creature that could look at a pile of bison bones and see not a graveyard, but the framework of a home. This was a profound cognitive shift. Survival here required a different kind of memory, not just the memory of a season, but the memory of a lifetime. Remembering the path the reindeer took last year and the year before that. Remembering the place where the river is shallow enough to cross in the spring thaw. Remembering the story the old hunter told about how to face a cave lion and not be eaten. This was a world that rewarded patience, cooperation, and the slow, steady accumulation of knowledge. And for tens of thousands of years, this is how we lived. Small bands of people moving through a world of giants. Their entire existence, a quiet, stubborn argument against the ice. They did not conquer the steppe. They learned to listen to it. And in that listening, they became something new. They became the people of the ice. And we must be careful not to imagine them as brutes. The minds that navigated this world were as complex and subtle as our own. They were not just surviving. They were thinking, feeling, and beginning to weave the world into a story. The evidence is spare, etched into fragments of bone and ivory, but it is undeniable. At sites across the steppe, from the Prehistoric site in Moravia to Kosti in Russia, we find more than just tools. We find ornaments, pierced wolf teeth, Arctic fox incisors drilled with tiny, perfect holes, beads from the dense, creamy ivory of a mammoth tusk. These were not accidents. Making a single bead from ivory with only stone tools is an act of immense patience. It requires hours of careful scraping, grinding, and drilling. These objects had no practical function. You could not hunt with them. You could not eat them. You could not use them to stay warm. Their only function was meaning. Perhaps they marked a person's identity, their kinship, their clan. A necklace of wolf teeth might have signified a great hunter, a person who had earned the right to wear the spirit of the predator. Perhaps they were used in trade, a physical currency of trust between scattered groups, a way of saying we remember our connection. Or perhaps they were something deeper still. A prayer, an offering, a tangible piece of a soul worn against the skin. We do not know. But we know that the people who wore them were not just living in the world. They were interpreting it. They were taking the raw materials of their environment, the teeth of the wolf, the tusk of the mammoth hand, transforming them into symbols. And a symbol is a bridge between the visible world and the invisible one. This was the quiet magic of the Ice Age mind. The ability to see a second world layered just beneath the surface of the first. A world of spirits, ancestors, and forces that moved in the wind and spoke in the crackle of the fire. And it is in this context that the landscape itself transformed. A mountain was no longer just a pile of rock. It was the home of a spirit. A river was not just a source of water. It was a living being with a temper and a memory. The animals themselves were not just meat and hide. They were kin. They were messengers. They were other people who walked on four legs and wore coats of fur. To hunt a mammoth was not just a logistical challenge. It was a sacred act. An act that required respect, apology, and ritual. The hunters would have known the mammoth's ways, its habits, its family structures. They would have seen the grief of a mother mammoth for her lost calf. And in that recognition, in that shared understanding of loss and family, the line between human and animal would have blurred. This is not romantic speculation. It is the worldview we see reflected in the surviving cultures of the North. The Inuit, the Sami, the Siberian peoples whose ancestors lived through the final days of the Ice Age. For them, the world is not a collection of resources. It is a web of relationships. And every relationship requires a story. And so they told stories. Sitting in their mammoth bone huts, huddled around a fire fed with animal fat and dried dung, they filled the long, dark winter nights with words. Stories of the first mammoth, the great trickster raven who stole the sun, the woman who married a bear. Stories that were not just entertainment. They were the encyclopedias of the steppe. They were the maps of the world, encoding the locations of sacred sites and migration routes. They were the textbooks of survival, teaching the young how to track a bison, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to find medicinal plants beneath the snow, and they were the laws of their society, explaining the rules of kinship, the responsibilities of the hunter, the duties of the firekeeper in a world without writing. Story was everything. It was the thread that bound a small, fragile band of people together. It was the memory that allowed them to survive in a world that was actively trying to erase them. And so we are left with this portrait, a vast frozen grassland ruled by giants and silence. And in the middle of it all, a few thousand scattered bands of Homo sapiens, creatures of warmth in a world of cold, creatures of story in a world without words. They were not yet the masters of the planet. They were just one small part of a vast interconnected ecosystem, a single clever predator in a world full of much larger, much stronger ones. Their entire existence was a quiet, desperate and beautiful act of defiance. An argument whispered into the wind, that a mind could be warmer than fur, that a story could be sharper than a claw, and that a small fire tended with care could hold back a winter that seemed like it would last forever. The Mammoth Steppe is gone now. The glaciers have retreated. The giants are dust. But for 100,000 years, this was the stage on which the human spirit was forged. And the lessons we learned there about community, about memory, about the art of finding warmth in the deepest cold are still with us, written not in stone, but in our bones, and in the stories we still tell, long after the ice has gone. The greatest predator of the Ice Age was not the cave lion. It was not the dire wolf, nor the giant short-faced bear. The greatest predator was the cold itself. It was a silent, invisible hunter that stalked every living thing every hour of every day. It did not need claws or teeth. It killed with stillness. It killed with the slow, creeping theft of warmth, from a body until the heart grew quiet and the breath turned to ice. For a tropical primate born in the warm savas of Africa, to survive in this world was a biological absurdity. Our bodies are built to release heat, not to contain it. Our long limbs, our hairless skin, these are the adaptations of a creature that fears the midday sun, not the midnight frost. By all logic, we should not have been there. We should have remained in the warm parts of the world, leaving the ice to the mammoths and the rhinos. But we did not. We stayed and we survived, not by changing our bodies, but by inventing a second one. A second skin crafted from the bodies of the creatures who were already adapted to the cold. The idea of wearing animal hides was not new. Even our distant ancestors, the Neanderthals, likely draped themselves in untanned pelts for basic protection. But a simple drape is not enough when the temperature drops to 40 degrees below zero. A loose cloak cannot hold back a wind that cuts like a blade of obsidian. To survive the true deep cold of the Ice Age, you needed more than a blanket. You needed an architecture of warmth. You needed clothes. And to make clothes, you need a technology so subtle, so small that it is easy to miss its revolutionary power. You need the needle. The first true sewing needles appear in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago, though the technology they represent is likely much older. We find them at sites like Kosteni in Russia and Sunier, tiny polished slivers of bone or mammoth ivory sharpened to a fine point, and at one end a small, perfect drilled hole, the eye of the needle. That tiny hole is one of the most important inventions in human history. It is the difference between wrapping and tailoring, between a crude poncho and a fitted parka, between surviving the autumn and surviving the winter. With an eyed needle, you can pass a thread of sinew or plant fiber through two pieces of hide and pull them tightly together, creating a seam. A seam that is not just strong but airtight. And in an Ice Age world, air is the enemy. Every gap, every draft is a channel through which the cold can steal your life. The people who made these needles were masters of their materials. We can call them the needle makers. They knew which bones were the strongest, which parts of an animal's leg or a bird's wing would yield a sliver that would not snap under pressure. They would have used sharp flint burr to carve the basic shape, then ground the point against a sandstone block, hour after hour, until it was lethally sharp. And then the hardest part, drilling the eye. Using a tiny razor-sharp flint micro-drill, they would have carefully, patiently twisted and twisted, applying just enough pressure to bore a hole without shattering a day's work. It was an act of incredible skill and focus, and the result was a tool that allowed for a revolution in human biology. For the first time, we could create a personal, portable microclimate. Think of an Ice Age hunter's clothing. It was not a single garment. It was a system of layers. The inner layer worn against the skin would have been made from the softest, most supple hides. The skin of a thorn, an Arctic fox, or a hair tanned to a buttery softness using animal brains and smoke. This layer wicked away sweat, a crucial function because frozen sweat is a fast track to hypothermia. The outer layer was for protection. The thick, shaggy hide of a reindeer, a bison, or a wolf. This layer was worn with the fur facing outwards, creating a dense barrier against the wind and snow. It had to be waterproof, which meant it had to be treated with rendered fat or oil. And between these layers was the secret air. Trapped air is the greatest insulator. By creating multiple fitted layers, the needlemakers were designing a wearable pocket of stillness. The air warmed by the body would remain close, a buffer against the infinite cold of the world outside. This was not just wrapping. This was not just wrapping. Engineering. They invented sleeves, leggings, mittens, boots, and the single most important garment of the Ice Age, the hooded parka. A garment that could be pulled tight around the face, leaving only a small tunnel for the eyes and mouth. A design so effective that it is still used today by the peoples of the Arctic. This was technology as advanced and as life-saving as any we have ever invented. But a second skin of clothing, no matter how perfectly stitched, was not enough. The cold was not just a danger you faced on the hunt. It was a constant presence, a siege that lasted for 8 months of the year. A human body cannot remain exposed to that kind of relentless pressure indefinitely. It needs rest, it needs shelter, it needs a place where the wind stops. In the warmer parts of the world, a simple lean-to of branches or a shallow cave might have been enough. But on the Mammoth Steppe, there were no forests to provide timber, and caves were often claimed by predators far larger, more dangerous than a small band of humans. The cave bear, a creature the size of a grizzly, hibernated in the deep limestone chambers of Europe. To challenge one for its home was to invite death. So the people of the Ice Age learned to build, not with wood, not with stone in the way we think of it, but with the remains of the very giants they hunted. They learned to build houses from the bones of the dead. This is the technology of the mammoth hut, and it is one of the most haunting and ingenious forms of architecture ever conceived. At sites like Mezerich in Ukraine, Kostany in Russia, and Doli Vesternish in the Czech Republic, archaeologists have unearthed the ghostly outlines of these ancient homes. They were not random piles of bone. They were deliberately designed structures built to withstand the crushing force of the steppe winds and the immense weight of the winter snow. The foundation was often a circle of mammoth skulls dug slightly into the frozen ground, their great curved tusks interlocking to form a sturdy defensive wall. These skulls, weighing hundreds of pounds each, were not easily moved. The people who built these homes, let us call them the half-builders, would have had to work together, using levers of wood and ropes of hide to drag and position each one. It was an act of communal engineering. Upon this foundation they would build the frame. The great arching ribs of mammoths were used as rafters. Long, straight leg bones became support posts. The wide, flat shoulder blades were used as shingles or door frames. They created a dome-shaped skeleton, a hemisphere of ivory and bone that rose from the frozen plains like a strange white hill. This skeleton was then covered. Layers of animal hides, reindeer, horse, bison were stretched to over the bone frame and stitched together. Hundreds of hides would be needed for a single dwelling, a testament to the skill of the hunters and the tireless work of those who prepared the skins. Finally, the entire structure was insulated. Thick sods of frozen turf were cut from the ground and stacked against the base of the walls, creating a final wind-proof seal. The result was a home dark, smoky, and smelling of fat and ash and old hide, but warm. Inside, a central hearth, carefully lined with stones, would have been the center of everything. The fire, fed with scavenged driftwood, dried grasses, or even the fat-rich bones of the animals themselves, was the beating heart of the home. It provided light in the endless dark of the Arctic winter. It provided warmth against a cold that could freeze a person solid in minutes, and it provided a space for community. Inside these small, circular spaces, entire generations lived out their lives. Children were born, stories were told, tools were made, the sick were tended to, the dead were mourned. Archaeological excavations of these huts reveal a life that was highly organized. Different areas were used for different tasks. Flint-knapping debris is often found in one corner near the entrance where the light was best. Sleeping areas lined with soft furs were typically at the back away from the drafts. Pits were dug into the floor for storing frozen meat or precious tools. These were not just shelters, they were worlds. Each one a tiny, fragile bubble of warmth and humanity, adrift in a vast frozen ocean. And they were not temporary. The layers of ash in the halves, the accumulated debris on the floors, these tell a story of return. The half-builders and their families would have lived a mobile life in the short summer, following the herds across the open steppe. But when the first snows of winter began to fall, they would return. Return to the same valley, the same river bend, the same small familiar dome of bone and hide, return to the home their ancestors had built. This is a profound shift in human behavior. It is the beginning of a sense of place, a sense of belonging, not just to a family or a clan, but to a specific spot on the earth. A home. And it was a home built from memory, the memory of how to interlock the tusks, the memory of how to lash the ribs together with sense, the memory of which hides were the thickest, the most resistant to the wind. This knowledge was the true architecture of the Ice Age. A blueprint passed down not on paper but in voice and gesture from one generation of half-builders to the next. A quiet, stubborn act of remembering how to create warmth from the bones of the cold. A second skin of clothing could protect a body in motion. A home of bone and hide could offer a sanctuary for the night. But neither could exist without the third and most important art of warmth. The one that was not an object but a process, not a thing you made, but a thing you kept alive, the tended fire. For the people of the Ice Age, fire was not a convenience. It was not a luxury. It was the fragile, flickering center of existence itself. It was the sun brought down to earth and held captive in a small circle of stones. To let it die was to let the world die with it. We do not know for certain when humans first mastered the art of making fire from scratch. The techniques of friction with a bow drill or percussion with flint and pyrite are ancient, but they leave almost no archaeological trace. What we do know is that by the peak of the Ice Age, humans had mastered the art of keeping it. And in a world where dry tinder was buried under meters of snow for most of the year, keeping a fire was a far more critical skill than starting one. This duty would have fallen to a person of immense importance, someone with patience, with foresight, with a deep understanding of the subtle language of flame and fuel. We can call this person the firekeeper. Their work was not dramatic. It was a slow, quiet, and constant ritual. Before the hunters left at dawn, the firekeeper would already be awake, gently coaxing the embers from the previous night back to life. They would have fed it carefully, not with precious wood, which was scarce on the treeless steppe, but with whatever the frozen world offered, dried mosses and grasses collected in the brief summer and carefully stored. The oil-rich bones of bison and reindeer, which burned with a slow, smoky heat and rendered animal fat, lumps of it placed on the coals to create a long-lasting, steady flame. Throughout the day, the firekeeper's attention would never stray far from the hearth. They would manage the fuel, adding a piece of bone here, a handful of dried dung there. They would read the color of the smoke, the height of the flame, the sound of the crackle, knowing what each signal meant. A sputtering flame might mean the fuel was damp. A plume of dark smoke might mean the fat was burning too quickly. It was a constant conversation, a partnership between a human mind and a chemical reaction. And when the band needed to move, the fire moved with them. The firekeeper would perform the most sacred and delicate of tasks. They would carefully select the hottest, most stable embers from the hearth and place them in a container. Perhaps a hollowed-out stone lined with moss, or a pouch of thick uncurded hide, or even a large seashell carried inland from a forgotten coast. This container, this portable heart, was then carried, carefully shielded from the wind on the long walk across the steppe. The survival of the entire group depended on the steady hand and unwavering focus of the person who carried it. To stumble, to let the wind in, to let the ember cool, was to risk everything. When they arrived at a new camp, the first act, before the hunters unpacked their spears, before the shelters were raised, would have been to build a new hearth, a new circle of stones. And into this circle, the firekeeper would place the living ember, and with a gentle breath, give it a new home. In this way, the fire of a clan could be kept alive for generations. A single continuous flame passed down from mother to daughter, from father to son, a flicker of warmth that was born in a distant time in a forgotten place, a direct, unbroken lineage of light. This was not just a technology, it was an ancestry. And around that ancestral flame, life unfolded. Fire was the first true transformation technology. It turned raw, indigestible meat into soft, life-giving food. It thawed frozen carcasses, making them butcherable. It could even be used to shape tools. A wooden spear tip hardened in the coals could pierce hide as effectively as stone. But its most important transformation was social. The hearth was the gravitational center of the group. It was the place where the community gathered in the crushing darkness of the polar night. It was the only source of light, and in its warm, flickering glow, faces were seen, expressions were read, bonds were formed. It was here that the needlemakers stitched their garments. It was here that the flint knappers shaped their blades. And it was here that the storytellers spoke. The fire did not just illuminate faces. It illuminated the mind, the dancing shadows it cast on the bone walls of the hut, the unpredictable flicker and crackle. This was the first cinema, the first screen onto which the human imagination could project its dreams, its fears, and its memories. The fire was not a silent thing. It was a collaborator in the act of creation, and in its presence in that small shared circle of warmth, the fragile, scattered minds of a few isolated humans became something more. They became a culture. The art of warmth then was not one skill but three. The needle to create a personal world, the hut to create a shared world, and the fire to create a world of the mind. Without these, we would have been just another tropical ape, lost in the snow. But with them we became the people of the ice, a species that learned not just to survive the cold, but to make a home within it. A species that learned that the greatest warmth comes not from the sun, but from the things we make and the stories we share together in the dark. The fire could keep you warm. The needle could clothe your body. The hut could shield you from the wind. But none of them could fill your stomach. Survival on the Mammoth Steppe was a constant, relentless negotiation with hunger. The cold burned calories at a furious rate. To simply stay alive, to generate the internal heat needed to survive a single winter night required a massive and continuous intake of energy. And on the frozen plains, there was only one place to find that kind of energy: fat. The lean meat of a rabbit or a bird was not enough. The starchy roots buried beneath the permafrost were few and far between. Life here demanded the rich, dense, life-sustaining fat of the great beasts, the thick layer of blubber on a woolly rhino, the rich, oily marrow locked inside the leg bone of a bison, the mountain of flesh and fat that was a single walking mammoth. To live here was to hunt giants. This was not a sport. It was not an act of courage, in the way we might think of it. It was a cold, calculated, and terrifying necessity, and it was the single most dangerous thing an Ice Age human could do. We must erase the popular image from our minds. The cartoon of a few shouting men in loincloths, waving crude clubs, chasing a panicked mammoth into a pit. The reality was quieter, slower, and infinitely more intelligent. To hunt a creature that stands 3 meters at the shoulder, weighs 6 tons, and is armed with 5 meters tusks, is not a battle of strength. A mammoth could kill a human with a single casual shrug of its head. To face such a creature with nothing but a sharpened stick and a fragile, warm-blooded body was to invite annihilation. You did not fight a mammoth, you outthought it. The hunt did not begin with a chase. It began days, perhaps weeks before, with an act of collective imagination. It began in the quiet of the hut around the fire with the elders and the most experienced hunters. Let us call them the mammoth stalkers. Work was a science of observation and memory. They would have known the herds in their territory intimately, not as a faceless mass of animals but as families. They would have recognized the matriarch, the old wise female who led the group. They would have known the young boisterous males, the vulnerable calves, and the lone aging bulls who sometimes wandered at the edge of the herd. Their first decision was the most important. Which one? Not the strongest. Never the strongest. Not the matriarch whose death could shatter the entire herd's social structure and send them migrating out of the territory forever. You chose the weak, the young, the old, the isolated, the one whose absence the herd could endure. This was not cowardice. It was a profound ecological wisdom, an understanding that your own survival depended on the survival of the herd. You did not destroy your larder. You culled it. Once the target was chosen, the stalk began. This was a slow, patient process of tracking and waiting. The hunters would move downwind, their bodies low to the ground, using the sparse cover of frozen riverbanks and low rolling hills. Their clothing of animal hide would have provided not just warmth, but camouflage, allowing them to blend into the muted colors of the steppe. They would have moved with a silence we can no longer practice, every footstep placed with care, every rustle of their clothing a potential betrayal. Their weapons were simple, but they were not crude. The primary tool was the spear, not a flimsy throwing stick, but a heavy thrusting spear 3 to 4 meters long. The shaft, carved from the rare, precious wood of a birch or pine that grew in a sheltered river valley, would have been straightened over a fire and sanded smooth with stone. The tip was the critical element. Sometimes it was the fire-hardened wood itself sharpened to a lethal point, but more often it was a piece of stone or bone exquisitely crafted. The spear points from this era are masterpieces of pragmatic design. Flakes of flint shaped into long leaf-like blades with edges so sharp they could slice through a mammoth's thick leathery hide, or points carved from mammoth ivory itself, turning the strength of the beast against its own kind. These points were not just tied to the shaft, they were set in place with a powerful adhesive, a glue made from birch bark tar. The hunters would surround the creature, their spears held low. They would not charge, they would harass. A quick dash in, a deep thrust into the flank or the soft underbelly, and a quick retreat before the tusks could swing around, bleed the animal, weaken it, confuse it. They would keep it moving, denying it the chance to rest, to staunch its wounds. They would drive it toward exhaustion. Hours would pass. The sun would move across the pale sky. The hunters, fueled by a primal focus, would feel neither the cold nor their own fatigue. Their world would shrink to this single monumental task, this great bleeding beast at the center of their circle. And finally, the moment would come. The mammoth, bellowing in pain and confusion, its legs trembling from exhaustion and blood loss, would stumble. It would fall to its knees. And in that moment, the hunters would close in. The final thrusts would be to the heart, the lungs, the neck. An act of brutal, intimate, and necessary violence. The great giant of the steppe would shudder, its last breath rising as a great cloud of steam in the frozen air, and then it would be still. The silence that followed would have been profound. The silence of the wind, the silence of the vast empty landscape, and the silence of the great life that had just ended. In that moment, there would have been no cheers of victory, no triumphant celebration. There would have been exhaustion, relief, and perhaps a kind of solemn reverence. The hunters, leaning on their blood-stained spears, their bodies aching, would have stood for a moment in the presence of what they had done. They had taken one of the great spirits of the world and turned it into meat. But the work was not over. In many ways, it had just begun. A 6-ton mammoth is not a meal. It is a mountain of resources, and processing it before the scavengers arrived, the wolves, the hyenas, the wolverines, who would have been drawn by the scent of blood from miles away, was a race against time. The first act was one of gratitude. Many modern hunter-gatherer cultures who hunt large game perform a ritual of thanks, an apology to the animal's spirit, a promise that its body will be used with respect, that nothing will be wasted. It is likely that our Ice Age ancestors did the same. Perhaps a sprinkle of red ochre on the mammoth's great head, perhaps a quiet song hummed into the wind, a recognition that a great power had been taken, and a debt was owed. Then the butchery began. This was a task for the entire community. Messengers would have been sent back to the camp, and soon the site would be swarming with people. The women, the elders, the older children, everyone had a role. The tools used for this work were not the heavy spears of the hunt, but a specialized kit of stone blades, great heavy cleavers for hacking through the thickest parts of the hide. long, sharp flint knives for slicing away the muscle, small, delicate scrapers for cleaning the fat from the inside of the skin. The body of the mammoth was a complex puzzle, and they knew its anatomy perfectly. They would have worked systematically. First, the hide, a priceless resource. It would take a dozen people hours to skin the entire animal. The hide so thick and heavy it had to be rolled away in sections. This skin, once cleaned and tanned, would become the walls of their huts, the blankets for their beds, the leather for their winter boots. Then the meat, great slabs of red muscle carved from the bone and laid out on the frozen ground to be portioned. Some would be eaten immediately, roasted over a roaring fire built right there beside the carcass, a feast of fresh hot meat to reward the hunters and replenish their energy. But most would be prepared for storage, cut into thin strips and hung on racks to be frozen dried by the cold, dry wind, or pounded into a paste with rendered fat and berries to make pemmican, a high-energy, long-lasting food that could be carried on long journeys. Nothing was wasted. The stomach and intestines would be carefully cleaned and used as water bags or storage containers. The tendons and senos, long and incredibly strong, would be dried and braided into cordage. The thread for sewing their clothes, the rope for lashing their shelters, the bowstrings for their smaller hunts, the great bones themselves were a form of currency, the long straight femurs and tibers, the arching ribs, the massive shield-like shoulder blades. These were the building materials of their world. They would be hauled back to the camp. A great effort of communal labor to repair the walls of an old hut or to build a new one. The tusks, the ivory, were the most precious of all. Harder than wood, more beautiful than bone. Ivory was the raw material of their art, their symbols, and their most personal tools. From it, the needlemakers would carve their delicate needles. From it, artists would carve the strange, powerful figures of Venus or the likenesses of the animals they hunted. From it, they would make beads, pendants, and even musical instruments. And finally, the marrow, locked deep inside the largest bones, was a substance more valuable than meat. Marrow is almost pure fat, a super-concentrated source of calories. The half-builders would use heavy stone hammers to crack open the femurs, exposing the waxy, rich marrow within. This would be eaten raw, a delicacy for the hunters and the elders. Or it would be rendered down over the fire into a clear liquid oil used for cooking, for treating hides, and as fuel for their simple stone lamps. To us it might look like a scene of brutal industrial efficiency, but for them it was a communion. The body of the mammoth was not just a resource, it was a gift from the spirit of the steppe, a gift that provided everything. Food, clothing, shelter, tools, art. The entire physical and symbolic world of an Ice Age community could be built from the body of a single great beast. The hunt for a mammoth was not just about getting a meal. It was a foundational act of their culture. It was the event that bound the community together, reinforcing the bonds of trust and mutual dependence. The hunters had to trust each other with their lives. The community had to trust the hunters to provide, and everyone had to work together to process the gift. The successful hunt was the story that would be told around the fire for the rest of the winter. The storytellers would recount every detail. The way the old bull turned at the ravine, the courage of the young hunter who made the first spear thrust, the way the matriarch of the herd called out in grief. These stories were not just entertainment. They were instruction manuals embedding the hard-won knowledge of the hunt into the collective memory of the group. They taught the children how to be brave, how to be patient, and how to respect the spirits of the animals. And so the high stakes of an Ice Age meal were not just about survival. They were about identity. To be a person of the Mammoth Steppe was to be a person who lived in a world of giants, a person who understood the immense power of the natural world and their own small, fragile but clever place within it. They did not see themselves as masters of nature. They saw themselves as part of it, a dangerous thinking part, but a part nonetheless. They knew that the mammoth was not an enemy. It was a worthy adversary, a powerful spirit and the source of their life. And in the deep frozen silence of the steppe, this relationship, this dance of hunter and hunted, of respect and violence, was the very heart of what it meant to be human. It was a life of incredible risk and incredible reward, a life lived on the edge, in the shadow of giants, a life where a single well-placed spear could mean the difference between starvation and survival, between a story that ends in the snow and a story that is told for another generation. And for 100,000 years they told the story, and they survived. There are places in this world that were never meant for living. places of absolute silence and a darkness so profound that it has no modern equivalent. A darkness that is not just the absence of light but a physical presence. A heavy velvet weight that presses against the eyes and swallows all sense of direction, all sense of time. These are the deep caves of the earth, the limestone labyrinths that wind for miles beneath the frozen hills of Ice Age Europe. Cold, damp, and utterly devoid of life. No animal shelters here. No plants can grow. This is the underworld. And yet our ancestors went inside. They did not go to find shelter. They did not go to find food. They went with a purpose that is so strange, so unnecessary, so profoundly human that we are still struggling to understand it. They went to paint, squeezing through impossibly narrow passages, crawling on their bellies over sharp, wet rock, sometimes descending hundreds of meters into the planet's core. They carried with them a few simple things. A hollowed-out stone lamp filled with animal fat. A wick of moss or juniper glowing with a small, sputtering flame. A pouch of powdered pigment. Red and yellow ochre ground from iron-rich earth. Black mangoneses dug from the rock itself. And an idea. On the silent waiting walls of these deep caves, they left behind a universe. Not a record of their daily lives, not portraits of themselves, but a world of animals. Horses with wide, intelligent eyes and flaring nostrils. Great shaggy bison, their massive shoulders humped with power, their horns sharp against the stone, stags with magnificent antlers branching across the ceiling. And the predators, the great cave lions, drawn without manes, their jaws open in a silent roar. The cave bears lumbering through the shadows. This was not clumsy doodling. This was the work of masters. We can call them the painters of the dark. And they were artists of a caliber that would not be seen again for 30,000 years. They understood things that we would later name. Perspective, shading, the use of the natural contours of the cave wall to give a sense of three-dimensional life to a painted form. A bulge in the rock becomes the powerful shoulder of a bison. A crack in the limestone becomes the wound from a spear. They use techniques that are still taught in art schools today. They would grind their pigments into a fine powder and mix them with a binder, perhaps water from the cave pools, perhaps animal fat, or even their own saliva. They applied the paint with brushes made from animal hair or chewed twigs. They used pads of moss or fur to blend and smudge the colors. And sometimes they would put the pigment in their mouths, and with a hollow bone or red spray it onto the wall, creating a fine, misty silhouette. An effect like airbrushing born in the belly of the earth. Consider Chauvet Cave in what is now southern France. Its entrance was sealed by a rock slide over 20,000 years ago, creating a perfect time capsule, hidden from the world. When it was rediscovered in 1994, it was as if someone had opened a door directly into the Ice Age mind. The art inside is a masterpiece, dated to an astonishing 36,000 years ago. It is among the oldest and most sophisticated art ever created. The walls are not just covered in images, they are composed. In one panel, a herd of horses seems to thunder across the rock, their heads tossed back, their muscles tense. Nearby, two woolly rhinoceroses face off, their great horns lowered in a moment of frozen primal conflict. And deeper inside, in a chamber that feels like a sanctuary, is the panel of the lions, a pride of 16 cave lions, their bodies overlapping, their heads turned in unison as if they have just caught the scent of something. Their eyes are focused, their ears are pricked. They are not just animals. They are a single coordinated intelligence, a collective predator captured in a moment of perfect, terrifying focus. This is not just observation. This is storytelling. The painters of the dark were not just recording the animals they saw. They were depicting their essence, their spirit, their power. They were painting the idea of the lion. And then there is Lascaux, discovered in 1940 by a group of teenage boys, younger than Chauve, created around 17,000 years ago. Its art is a symphony of color and motion. The most famous chamber, the Hall of the Bulls, is a swirling, overlapping panorama of giant oryx, ancient wild cattle drawn on a monumental scale, some over 5 meters long. They are not static. They are stampeding, charging, thundering across the ceiling in a silent, eternal hunt. The artists used the natural white of the calcite wall as their canvas and painted with bold, confident strokes of black and red and yellow. What were they doing? Why here? Why crawl into these dangerous, inaccessible, pitch-black places to create masterpieces that perhaps only a handful of people would ever see? This is the central mystery of the Ice Age, and there are no easy Answers only theories like echoes in a dark cave. One of the oldest theories is that of hunting magic, the idea that to paint the animal was to gain a kind of spiritual power over it. By capturing its likeness, you could ensure a successful hunt. By drawing a spear, striking its flank, you were performing a ritual that would later come true in the world outside. There is some evidence for this. Many of the animals are depicted with lines or dots that could be interpreted as wounds or spears, but it does not explain everything. Why are so many of the animals, the most dangerous ones like lions and bears, almost never shown being hunted? And why are the most commonly hunted animals like reindeer so rarely depicted in the great galleries? Another theory suggests that these caves were not hunting manuals, but places of shamanic ritual, places where a spiritual specialist, a shaman, would enter a trance state to journey into the spirit world. The cave itself was a portal, a membrane, between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. The animals on the walls were not pictures. They were the spirits themselves, emerging from the rock, their forms guided by the cracks and fissures in the stone. In this view, the art is not a creation, but a revelation. The shaman was not an artist, but a conduit. The flickering light of the fat lamp would have made the animals seem to move, to breathe, to dance. The low oxygen levels deep in the cave, the echoing sounds, the profound darkness, all of this could have helped to induce an altered state of consciousness, a journey into the other side. This shamanic theory is compelling, and it connects to another stranger pattern in the art. Alongside the magnificent animals, we find other marks, geometric shapes, grids of dots, parallel lines, strange feathery shapes called tectap and spirals. These abstract signs are found in caves all across Europe, a kind of shared symbolic language that we cannot yet read. Neuroscientists who study altered states of consciousness have pointed out something remarkable. These same geometric patterns, the dots, the grids, the spirals, are the kinds of phosphenes and synoptic phenomena that people see in the early stages of a trance. The patterns are generated not by the outside world, but by the internal architecture of our own visual cortex. Is it possible that the painters of the dark were depicting not only the spirits they saw in the other world, but the very fabric of the journey to get there? Were these signs a map not of the land, but of the mind? And then there are the handprints, hundreds of them in dozens of caves. Sometimes they are positive prints, a hand dipped in pigment and pressed against the stone. But more often they are negative stencils, a hand held flat against the wall and a fine spray of red or black ochre blown around it, leaving a ghostly silhouette. I was here. It is the oldest, most personal and most universal signature in human history. Some of these hands are missing fingers. Were they the victims of frostbite? Or were they a sign of ritual mutilation, a sacrifice made to the spirits of the cave? Or perhaps were they a form of sign language, a silent story told in the shape of the hand? We see hands of men, women, and even very small children. It seems that the entire community, not just a single artist or shaman, was involved in the life of these caves. But perhaps the most profound theory is also the simplest. Perhaps these caves were sanctuaries of memory. In a world without writing, with a culture that lived entirely in oral tradition, memory was everything. But memory is fragile. It can be distorted. It can be forgotten. What if these caves were a way to make memory permanent? A way to anchor the most important stories, the most vital knowledge in a place that was beyond the reach of time, of weather, of forgetting. The animals on the walls were not just spirits. They were the characters in the great myths of creation. The story of the first bison, the tale of the great stag who brought the sun. By painting them, you were not just creating an image. You were inscribing your scripture onto the stone walls of a natural cathedral. You were building a library of the soul. This would explain why the caves were used for so long. Many of these sites were visited again and again for thousands of years. Generations of painters would return to the same chambers, sometimes painting new animals directly over the top of older ones, not to erase them, but to renew them, to add their own voice to the ancient chorus. The cave was not a gallery to be looked at. It was a living, breathing text, a place of pilgrimage, a place to remember who you were. It was a school where the young would be brought into the deep torch-lit darkness to learn the stories of their people, to see the great aurochs, the lion, the bear, and to understand their place in the cosmos, to place their own hand against the ghostly silhouette of an ancestor and to feel a connection across 1,000 years. This was their history book, their temple, their genesis, and it was born not in the light, but in the deep, silent, unchanging dark, whatever their precise purpose, magic, shamanism, or memory. These sanctuaries were not made lightly. The effort involved was immense. The pigments had to be sourced. The red and yellow ochres sometimes carried from quarries many kilometers away. They had to be ground into a fine powder using stone mortars, a laborious, dusty task. Scaffolding made from precious timber had to be built to reach the high ceilings, and the fat for the lamps. A single painting session would have required a huge amount of rendered animal fat to keep the darkness at bay. This was a major investment for a small mobile community. It tells us that whatever happened in these caves, it was not trivial. It was not a pastime. It was essential. It was as vital to their survival as the hunt itself because it fed. Something that meat could not. It fed the human need for meaning. And what about the humans themselves? They are almost entirely absent from the great galleries. For every 1,000 majestic animals, there is perhaps one human figure, and when they do appear, they are strange. Not realistic portraits, but stick figures, half animal, half human. The famous sorcerer of Tuafra's cave, a being with the antlers of a stag, the eyes of an owl, the tail of a wolf, and the legs of a man, the bird-headed man of Lascaux, falling before a disemboweled bison. Why this reluctance to depict ourselves? Perhaps it was a taboo, a fear that to capture a human likeness was to steal their soul. Or perhaps it was a form of humility, a recognition that in the grand sacred drama of the natural world, we were not the main characters. We were the witnesses, the listeners, the painters in the dark. Our role was not to be seen, but to see, to remember, and to record. And so for 20,000 years they did. Across the coldest, harshest period of the Ice Age, as the glaciers ground forward and the world outside was a battle for physical survival, our ancestors retreated into these silent, frozen wombs of the earth, and in the darkness they created a world of light, a world of color, of motion, of myth. A world that was perhaps more real to them than the one they lived in every day. And then, as the ice began to melt and the great herds of the steppe began to vanish, the painting stopped, the caves fell silent, the entrances collapsed or were forgotten, and the great galleries waited in the perfect, unchanging dark, their colors as vibrant as the day they were painted, waiting for a different kind of human with a different kind of light to stumble upon them. Once again, when we look at this art today, we are seeing more than just pictures of extinct animals. We are looking into the birth of our own consciousness. The moment when the human mind turned a corner and began to create a universe of its own. Making. A universe of symbols, of stories, of gods, a universe that we still live in today. We cannot know for certain why they did it. The painters of the dark took their secrets with them. But perhaps the answer is not as complex as we think. Perhaps they crawled into the darkness to leave a part of themselves behind to say to the great silent emptiness of time, "I was here. We were here. We saw the lions and we were afraid. We saw the horses and they were beautiful. We lived and we remembered." And in a world defined by the relentless cycle of hunting and hunger, of life and death, perhaps that simple act of remembering was the most powerful magic of all. The great art of the caves was a shared dream, a pilgrimage into the dark, a library of memory written on a monumental scale for the entire community. But the Ice Age mind did not only think in epics, it also whispered, and for every great bison painted on a cave wall there were 1,000 smaller, more personal acts of creation, objects small enough to be held in the palm of a hand, carried in a leather pouch, worn against the skin, or buried with the dead. These were not just tools or ornaments. These were the artifacts of an inner world, a world of spirits, of symbols, of a quiet personal conversation with the unseen forces that govern their lives. This was a faith not written in scripture, but carved in bone. And the most famous, most enigmatic of these objects are the ones we call Venus. Across the vast expanse of the Mammoth Steppe, from the Pyrenees Mountains in France to the shores of Lake Bal in Siberia, a strange and beautiful pattern emerges in the archaeological record. Small stylized figurines of the female form carved from mammoth ivory, soft soapstone, or fired from a mixture of clay and bone ash. They are not realistic portraits. They are symbols and they are remarkably consistent. The faces are often blank, abstract, or non-existent. The arms and feet are usually small, tapering to a point or omitted entirely. All the focus, all the artistic energy is directed toward the body. The breasts are large and heavy. The belly is soft and rounded. The hips and thighs are exaggerated, powerful. This is not the body of a hunter. This is the body of a mother, the body of a creator, the body of life itself. The most famous of these is the Venus of Willendorf found in Austria. Carved from limestone and stained with red ochre, she is faceless, her head covered in what looks like a woven cap or braided hair. Her entire being is an ode to fertility, to abundance, but she is just one of many. The Venus of Hohlfels from Germany is the oldest of them all. Carved from mammoth ivory over 35,000 years ago. She has no head at all, just a small ring for a cord, so she could be worn as a pendant. The Venus of Doli Viesta from the Czech Republic was crafted from clay and bone ash and deliberately fired in a kiln, making it one of the earliest examples of ceramic art in the world. She was found broken in two in a hearth at the center of a large communal hut. What were they? Were they goddesses, representations of a great Mother Earth, a single universal deity worshipped by the people of the Ice Age? This was the first great theory, and it is a beautiful one. It suggests a world united by a shared faith, a reverence for the life-giving power of the feminine. A world that worshipped creation, not destruction. In this view, these figurines were idols, objects of prayer, sacred icons placed in a home or a sanctuary. But other theories suggest a more personal, more intimate meaning. Perhaps they were not goddesses, but talismans, self-portraits made by women for women. Objects of power held during childbirth to ensure a safe delivery. Symbols of solidarity and shared experience in a world where birth was both a miracle and a mortal danger. This would explain the facelessness. She is not a specific woman. She is every woman. She is not a portrait of a face, but a portrait of a feeling of pregnancy, of motherhood, of the immense creative power held within the body. Another more pragmatic theory suggests they were a form of social currency. In a world of scattered mobile bands, these figurines could have been a way of signaling kinship and alliance. They were portable, recognizable, and valuable. Exchanging them between groups could have been a way to cement relationships, to build trust, to create a social network that stretched across the vast empty steppe. They were a kind of symbolic language, a way of saying, "We are the people who remember this shape. We are kin." And there is a darker, stranger possibility. Some researchers have noted that the exaggerated proportions of the figurines, the extreme obesity, are not typical of lean, active hunter-gatherer populations, but they do match the bodies of women suffering from severe starvation, a condition where the body goes into a desperate survival mode, storing fat in precisely these areas. Is it possible that these were not symbols of abundance, but symbols of scarcity? A prayer for fat, a magical totem created in the leanest, most desperate months of the winter. An act of sympathetic magic to bring back the life-giving richness the hunters sought. We will never know for sure. The minds that carved them are gone. The stories they were a part of have vanished into the cold air. But the objects remain, and they tell us that the people of the Ice Age were grappling with the great mysteries of existence, life, death, creation, and the strange, powerful magic of the female body. And it was not just the human form that they carved into their world of spirits. It was the animals. For every Venus figurine we find dozens of carved animal figures. Horses with their manes etched in fine detail. Bison with their great shaggy humps. And the mammoths, always the mammoths, their curving tusks and domed heads rendered with an intimate, almost tender accuracy. These were not just models. They were portraits of the other great peoples of their world. Sometimes these animal spirits were carved onto the tools of the hunt itself. The most beautiful of these are the spur throwers. A spear thrower, or ATL, is a simple but brilliant piece of technology. A carved stick that acts as a lever, dramatically increasing the force and range of a thrown spear. But our ancestors did not leave them as simple sticks. They turned them into art. At the site of Masdil in France, a spur thrower was found carved from reindeer antler into the shape of a young ibex. Its head turned back as if to watch two birds perched upon its own droppings. It is a moment of quiet, naturalistic observation, a joke, perhaps, a small, beautiful detail, carved into a weapon of death. What does it mean to carve a beautiful living animal onto the tool you will use to kill it? It is a paradox that sits at the very heart of the hunter's soul. It suggests a relationship with the animal world that is not one of simple domination. It is a relationship of respect, of intimacy, and of a deep spiritual entanglement. The animal was not just a resource, it was a power. And to carry its image with you was to carry a piece of that power. The swiftness of the horse, the strength of the bison, the endurance of the mammoth. These were not just physical attributes, they were spiritual qualities. And by carving them, by holding them, by touching them, The hunter was perhaps trying to borrow a piece of the animal's soul to become for a moment a little less human and a little more mammoth. This belief in an animal soul, a spirit that is separate from the physical body, is one of the oldest and most universal ideas in human culture. It is the foundation of animism. The worldview that sees all things, not just animals but rocks, rivers and trees, as being alive and aware. For the people of the Ice Age, the world was not a collection of dead objects. It was a living, breathing community of spirits. And the most important members of that community were the animals. And then there were the beings that were neither human nor animal, the hybrids, the shapeshifters. At the site of Hohensteinstad in Germany, a figure was found carved from mammoth ivory with astonishing skill. It has the body of a man standing upright, his arms at his sides, but it has the head of a lion, the Lowen-Mensch or lion man. Dated to 40,000 years ago. It is one of the oldest and most powerful pieces of art ever created. It is not a depiction of something that exists in the real world. It is a depiction of something that exists only in the imagination. This was a creature of myth, a god, a spirit, an ancestor, a shaman in the middle of a transformation. It represents a mind that is no longer just observing the world, but is actively creating new realities within it. A mind that can take the two greatest powers it knows, the intelligence of the human and the ferocity of the lion, and fuse them into a single terrifying and sacred being. The lion man is not a toy. It was found deep in a dark chamber of the cave, broken into pieces, perhaps intentionally as part of a ritual. It is a glimpse into a world of myth and cosmology so old and so complex that we have lost the language to even describe it. And this pattern of carving, of wearing, of carrying meaning extends to the smallest of things. The pierced teeth of a wolf, a fox, a bear worn as a necklace. Each tooth a trophy, a memory of a successful hunt. A piece of the animal's power worn close to the heart. Abstract patterns known as marad dias or hunter marks were scratched onto pieces of bone. Were they a tally of kills, a lunar calendar tracking the passage of time, or something more personal, a signature, a story known only to the carver? What all of this tells us is that the inner world of Ice Age people was rich, complex, and saturated with meaning. They did not live in a world of brute survival. They lived in a world of spirits, a world where a piece of carved ivory could hold the soul of a lion, where a necklace of teeth could protect you from harm, and where the body of a woman held the greatest mystery of all, the secret of creation itself. These small personal objects were a different kind of art from the great paintings in the deep caves. The cave art was communal, permanent, and rooted in a specific sacred place. But these carvings, these beads, these pendants were portable. They were a faith that could travel. In a life of constant movement, following the herds across the endless steppe, you could not carry a temple with you, but you could carry a goddess in your pocket. You could wear the spirit of the wolf around your neck. You could hold the soul of a mammoth in the palm of your hand. This was a spirituality perfectly adapted to a life of motion. It was a world of spirits that was as mobile as the people who believed in it. And this may be the key to understanding their inner world. It was a world where the sacred was not separate from the everyday. A weapon was also a work of art. A piece of jewelry was also a prayer. A home was also a mausoleum built from the bones of the sacred animals who gave them life. There was no line between the practical and the spiritual. Everything was infused with meaning. Everything had a story. We look at these objects now behind the glass of a museum case, and we see them as artifacts, static, silent, dead. But to the people who made them, they were alive. The Venus of Willendorf was not a stone. She was a presence. The Lion Man was not a carving. He was a power. And so we must imagine them not as artists in a studio, but as people in conversation with a living world, a person we can call the carver of souls, sitting by the fire in the deep of winter. The wind howling outside the mammoth bone hut, the world outside is a universe of white, silent danger. But in their hands, a piece of ivory warmed by their touch, and with a sharp flint blade, slowly, patiently, they begin to give it a second life. They are not just carving a shape, they are releasing a spirit. They are telling a story, not with words, but with their hands, a story of life, of power, of a world that is seen and a world that is felt. We cannot know the exact words of their myths. We cannot know the names of their gods or spirits. But in these small, powerful objects, they left us the grammar of their faith. a faith that saw the world not as something to be conquered, but as a great, mysterious, and living story. A story in which they were not the heroes but a single thinking and deeply entangled part. And perhaps that is the most profound spirit of all. There are journeys that change a family. There are migrations that change a people. And then there are journeys that change the world. Journeys so vast, so improbable, so consequential that they represent a turning point in the story of a species. Sometime around 25,000 years ago, as the last great glaciation reached its peak and the world was locked in its deepest freeze, a small band of Ice Age hunters stood on the edge of what is now Siberia. And they looked east. Before them lay a world that no human had ever seen, a continent that for the entire 3 million-year history of our lineage had remained separate, a world without people. America. They did not know what they were doing. There was no map. There was no destination. There was no promise of a new world. There was only the cold, the wind, and the tracks of the great herds leading eastward into the rising sun. And so they followed. This was not a single heroic expedition. It was a slow, multi-generational drift of people. A movement so gradual they would not have even perceived it as a migration. It was simply life following the mammoths, the bison, the caribou across a landscape that was itself a temporary ghost. This was Binga, the Bering Land Bridge. It was not a narrow, icy corridor. At the peak of the Ice Age, when so much of the world's water was locked up in the Great Glacius, the sea level was over 100 meters lower than it is today. The floor of the Bering Sea was exposed, creating a vast subcontinent of cold, dry steppe that connected Asia to America. It was 1,000 kilometers wide, a world of its own. For thousands of years, this was not a bridge to be crossed. It was a place to live. Genetic evidence suggests that the ancestors of the first Americans may have lived in the isolation of Bingia for up to 10,000 years. They were a people caught between two worlds, their connection to Asia slowly fading behind them, the great unknown continent of America waiting before them. Archaeologists call this the Bingian standstill. It was not a pause in a journey. It was the forging of a new people. Here in this windswept heartland of the Ice Age they adapted. They perfected the skills they had brought with them from the Siberian steppe. They became masters of the Arctic cold. We can call them the first comers. Their entire existence was tuned to the rhythms of this lost world. They understood the subtle signs of the permafrost, the behavior of the muskox, the way the winter stars wheeled over a landscape without trees. They hunted with small, exquisitely made stone tools, microlades set into bone or antler handles, a technology perfectly suited for a life of extreme mobility where every ounce of weight mattered. They wore sophisticated multi-layered clothing stitched with bone needles designed to keep them alive in a world where a moment of carelessness meant freezing to death. And then after millennia of waiting in this frozen heartland, the way opened. Not all at once, but slowly. A path began to emerge. For most of the Ice Age, America was guarded by two immense walls of ice, the Cordilleran ice sheet, which covered the Rocky Mountains of the west coast, and the Great Laurentide ice sheet, which buried the entire eastern half of the continent. These two glaciers were often fused together, creating an impenetrable barrier of ice thousands of kilometers long and several kilometers thick. No land animal and no human could pass. But around 16,000 years ago, as the planet began to warm slightly, the glaciers began to melt. A gap appeared between them. A long, narrow, and incredibly dangerous channel. The Ice-Free Corridor. This was not a gentle green valley. It was a landscape born of melting ice. A sterile wind-blasted corridor of gravel and mud, flooded by catastrophic meltwater lakes that could form and drain in a matter of days. The winds that howled down from the melting ice sheets would have been unimaginably fierce. Food was scarce. Shelter was non-existent. It was one of the most inhospitable landscapes on the planet. For decades, this corridor was believed to be the only path south. The story was that the first comers, the people of Bingia, waited until this path opened and then rushed through it, spreading out into the empty continent beyond. This was the Clovis first model, named for the distinctive fluted spear points found all across North America, dated to around 13,000 years ago. The Clovis people, the story went, were the first Americans, the brave mammoth hunters who conquered a continent in a few hundred years. But the story is not that simple. And the corridor may not have been the only way. In recent years, the evidence has begun to point to a different journey. A journey not through the ice, but around it. A journey by water. Archaeological sites have been found in the Americas that are older than the opening of the ice-free corridor. Monteverde in southern Chile has a layer of human occupation dated to at least 14,500 years ago, possibly even earlier. Paisley Caves in Oregon, the G-site in Texas, all show evidence of people in America before the ice corridor was a viable path for life. So, how did they get there? The new theory suggests that the first comers did not wait for the ice to part. They bypassed it using the same skills that had allowed their distant ancestors to reach Australia. They built boats, small watercraft perhaps made from animal skins stretched over a frame of driftwood. And in these small, fragile boats, they began a journey down the Pacific coast. This was the Kelp Highway, a rich marine ecosystem that stretched from Japan along the coast of Binja and all the way down to South America. It was a world of sheltered coves, abundant kelp forests, and a bounty of sea life: seals, sea lions, otter, seabirds, shellfish, fish. For a people who knew how to live from the sea, it was a road paved with food. This coastal migration would have been faster, safer, and far more reliable than the treacherous journey through the ice corridor. It explains how people could have reached Chile before they could have reached Montana. Unfortunately, this journey is now almost entirely invisible to us. Just as with the drowned world of Dogland, the coastal route into the Americas has been swallowed by the sea. As the great glaciers melted, sea levels rose by over 100 meters, inundating the ancient shorelines, the sheltered coves, and the beachside camps where the first comers made their landings. Their boats, made of skin and wood, have long since rotted away. Their footprints on the ancient beaches have been erased by 10,000 years of tides. The archaeological evidence of this great coastal migration is now lost, buried deep beneath the waves of the Pacific. We see only the faintest echoes of it. On the Channel Islands of California, human remains have been found dating back over 13,000 years alongside the bones of pygmy mammoths that lived only on those islands. The people who hunted them must have had boats. Further north in the coastal caves of British Columbia, recent excavations have uncovered hearths and stone tools in layers that date back over 14,000 years, from a time when the inland was still buried under a kilometer of ice. These are the whispers of a lost journey, a story not of a desperate rush through a frozen corridor, but of a patient, skillful leapfrog migration down a rich and vibrant coastline. A journey made by people who were not just hunters of the land, but mariners of the sea, a people we can call the coast walkers. And when they arrived, they stepped into a world that had never known the foot of a human. It is a moment that is almost impossible for us to comprehend, to be truly, completely the first. The animals had no evolved fear of this strange new two-legged predator. The great mammoths and mastodons of the American plains, the giant ground sloths, the camels and horses that roamed the continent. They would have looked upon these small fur-clad figures with a kind of naive curiosity, a curiosity that would soon prove fatal. For the first comers, this was a world of unbelievable abundance, a paradise of protein, and they were the most sophisticated and deadly hunter-gatherers the planet had ever produced. They carried with them the accumulated knowledge of 100,000 years of survival, the tailored clothing of the Arctic, the composite tools of the steppe, the social cooperation of the mammoth hunt, and perhaps the memory of the sea. As they spread out from the coast, moving inland along rivers, through forests and across the Great Plains, they found a continent teeming with life. And for a time, for a few brief explosive centuries, they must have felt like gods. This is where the Clovis culture appears. Around 13,000 years ago, a new powerful technology spreads across North America with astonishing speed. The Clovis point, a large, beautifully crafted spear point with a distinctive flute or channel at its base, which allowed it to be securely hafted onto a spear shaft. These were not just tools. They were weapons of incredible power and efficiency. And they are found almost always in association with the bones of mammoths. The Clovis people were the children of the first comers, the inheritors of the New World, and they were specialists. They were the true mammoth stalkers of America. Their entire toolkit, their settlement patterns, their very identity seems to have been built around the pursuit of these great beasts. The speed with which their culture spread is a testament to their success. In just a few hundred years, Clovis points are found from Nova Scotia to Mexico, a cultural signature that marked the conquest of a continent. But this world of giants, this paradise for hunters, was not to last. And the story of the first Americans is also the story of the first great American extinction. Within 1,000 years of the arrival of the Clovis people, most of the great megapora of North America were gone. The mammoths and mastodons, the giant sloths, the horses and camels, the saber-toothed cats and the dire wolves that hunted them all vanished. Was it the hunters? Was it the rapidly changing climate as the Ice Age came to its chaotic end? Or was it a combination of both? A perfect storm of a deadly new predator arriving in a world that was already ecologically unstable. The debate still rages among scientists, but the result is undeniable. The world that the first comers had discovered, they also unmade, and in doing so they were forced to change once again. As the great herds disappeared, the people of the Americas had to adapt. The Clovis culture vanished, replaced by a multitude of new, more localized traditions. People began to hunt smaller game like bison. They learned to fish in the great rivers, to gather nuts and seeds from the new forests that grew up as the climate warmed. The single unified focus of the mammoth hunt fractured into 1,000 different ways of being. The descendants of the first comers became the ancestors of the incredible diversity of cultures that would later flourish across 2 continents. The long walk was over, but the journey had just begun. What does it mean to be the first? To step into a world that has no memory of you to give a name to a river, a mountain, a herd of animals for the very first time. The first comers left us no written record of their journey, no epic poems of the Great Crossing, no maps of the drowned coastline. Their story is written only in stone points, in the genetics of their descendants, and in the ghostly absence of the great beasts they followed into this new world. It was perhaps the last time in human history that any person could walk in any direction and know for certain that they were not walking in the footsteps of an ancestor. They were creating the path. They were the ancestors, a small band of people carrying the fire of the old world into the heart of the new. A journey born of ice and guided by the sea, and it stands as a quiet testament to the restless, curious and terrifyingly adaptable spirit of a small, clever ape who, against all odds, had learned to walk across the world, and in doing so had learned to make it his own. For 100,000 years, the ice had been the only constant. It was the wall at the edge of the world, the source of the endless wind, the silent white god that had shaped the lives of every human, every animal, every plant on the planet. It seemed eternal, unchanging, absolute, and then it began to weep. Sometime around 20,000 years ago, the great cosmic rhythm of the Earth shifted once again. The planet's slow wobble, its tilt, its path around the sun. They realigned. This time not for cold but for warmth. The northern summers began to grow stronger. The sun felt a little closer, its light a little more golden. At first, the change was almost imperceptible, a slightly earlier spring, a winter that was a little less brutal than the one before. But the great ice sheets, they noticed. After millennia of relentless growth, for the first time they began to melt faster than they grew. The great thaw did not happen gracefully. It was a chaotic, violent, and unpredictable process, a planetary fever that broke in fits and starts. For 8,000 years the world was caught in a state of violent transformation. It was not a gentle spring. It was a catastrophe of water. The great glaciers 2 or 3 kilometers thick did not simply shrink. They collapsed. Vast rivers of meltwater began to flow on, under, and through the ice. They carved great tunnels within the glaciers and poured out at their edges in torrents that dwarfed any river we know today. Giant lakes of meltwater held back by dams of ice would form at the edge of the retreating glaciers. Lake Agassiz in North America was the largest of them all, larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. It held more water than every river and lake in the world today, and it was held back by a wall of rotting, unstable ice. Periodically, these ice dams would fail. The collapse of an ice dam on Lake Agassiz would have been one of the most violent events in recent geological history. A wall of water hundreds of meters high would have burst forth, releasing more water in a few days than the Amazon River discharges in a century. This was a flood of biblical proportions, a torrent that scoured the landscape down to bedrock, carving great canyons and washing away everything in its path. The mega-flood would have roared across continents before finally pouring into the ocean, and the oceans were rising. Every drop of meltwater from the dying glaciers, every catastrophic flood eventually found its way to the sea, and the sea began to reclaim its lost territory. For thousands, their entire memory of a place was being washed away, and their story is the story of every coastal people on Earth during this time. The Sundeer Shelf in Southeast Asia, the Bering Land Bridge between continents, all of it gone. The archaeological record of these people, their homes, their art, their bones, is now buried under 100 meters of water and silt. We know they existed, but we have lost their world. And as the land drowned, the climate was thrown into chaos. The great floods of fresh, cold meltwater pouring into the North Atlantic periodically disrupted the ocean currents that regulated the planet's temperature. This caused the thaw to stutter, to stop, and even to reverse. The most famous of these events was the Younger Dryas. Around 12,900 years ago, just as the world seemed to be settling into a new, warmer state, something snapped. The temperature in the northern hemisphere plummeted. In just a few decades, the world plunged back into a state of near glacial cold. Would last for over 1,000 years. The glaciers, which had been in full retreat, stopped and in some places even began to advance again. The new forests died. The old cold-loving plants returned for the humans who had just begun to adapt to the new warmer world. This was a brutal betrayal. The Nufian people of the Middle East, who had begun to live in settled villages, gathering the abundant wild grains of the thaw, were devastated. Their settlements were abandoned. Their food sources withered. They were forced back into a life of desperate mobility. The Younger Dryas was a stark and terrifying reminder that the ice had not yet given up its power. It was a final angry breath of the old world, a winter that returned from the dead. And it may have been the final trigger, the last brutal push that forced some human groups like the Nufians to move beyond simply gathering wild plants and to begin the slow, laborious process of cultivating them to invent farming, not as an act of progress, but as an act of desperation. And as the world of ice and water churned, the world of the giants was dying. The Mammoth Steppe, the vast, cold, dry grassland that had sustained the great herds for 100,000 years, was disappearing. As the climate warmed and grew wetter, the tough, hardy grasses and herbs they fed on were replaced by a different kind of vegetation. Mossy bogs and peatlands spread across the landscape, and then the trees returned. Great dense forests of birch and pine began to grow, their roots breaking up the ancient soils of the steppe. For the mammoths, the woolly rhinos, the giant bison, this was a disaster. They were creatures of the open plain. Their bodies were built for grazing on dry grass, their feet for walking on firm, frozen ground. They were not adapted to a world of wet, boggy forests. Their food was vanishing, and their habitat was closing in around them. The end was not quick. It was a long, slow, grinding extinction that played out over millennia. The great herds, which had once numbered in the tens of thousands, began to shrink. Their ranges contracted, pushed into smaller and smaller pockets of surviving steppe in the high Arctic of Siberia and North America. And the pressure from the new two-legged predator did not let up. The humans, who had once been a small and scattered part of this ecosystem, were now everywhere, and they were more efficient hunters than ever before. With the new forests came an abundance of wood for their fires and their tools. With the warmer climate came a population boom. The delicate balance that had existed for so long between the hunters and the hunted was broken. Was it the changing climate that killed the giants? Or was it the human hunters delivering the final decisive blows to animal populations that were already struggling to survive in a new world? The truth is likely that it was both a 1-2 punch of climate change and human predation from which the megapora could not recover. One by one, the great spirits of the Ice Age fell silent. The last woolly rhinoceroses vanished from Siberia around 14,000 years ago. The last of the great cave lions, the saber-toothed cats, the giant Irish elk with their magnificent antlers, all gone. The mammoths held on the longest. Small isolated populations survived on a few Arctic islands like Wrangler Island off the coast of Siberia until as recently as 4,000 years ago. A ghost of the Ice Age still walking the earth while the pyramids were being built in Egypt. But they were a relic, a memory. The great herds, the thundering heart of the steppe, were gone forever, and with their passing, a way of life ended. The human cultures that had been built around the mammoth, the hunters, the carvers, the storytellers, they had to change or die. Their entire world, their cosmology, their rituals, their identity had been woven from the hide and bone and spirit of these great beasts. Now their gods were dead. A profound cultural trauma, a spiritual extinction. That echoed the biological one happening all around them. The world had become a quieter, smaller, and less magical place. The age of giants was over. The great thaw was not just an ending. It was also a new beginning. The world that emerged from the ice was a different planet, It was a wetter, warmer, and greener world. The great monotonous expanse of the Mammoth Steppe was replaced by a complex and vibrant mosaic of new ecosystems. Dense deciduous forests in Europe, lush wetlands in the Middle East, expanding grasslands in the Americas, new rivers carved new paths, new lakes filled the great basins gouged out by the glaciers, and life in all its resilient opportunistic glory rushed in to fill empty spaces for the human survivors. This was a world of bewildering new possibilities and new challenges. They were no longer the people of the ice. They had to become the people of the forest, the people of the river, the people of the shore, the old skills, the deep knowledge of the mammoth. And the reindeer were no longer enough. They had to learn 1,000 new things. They had to learn the names and uses of hundreds of new plants. They had to learn how to hunt the small, fleet-footed deer and boar of the new forests. They had to learn how to build canoes to cross the new rivers, how to weave nets to catch the new fish that teemed within them. They had to become generalists again. The intense specialization of the mammoth hunt gave way to a broad, flexible, and incredibly creative period of adaptation. This was the dawn of the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, a time of quiet, revolutionary invention. But the thaw left behind one final profound legacy. It created the world that we now recognize. The coastlines, which had been in a state of chaotic retreat for millennia, finally began to stabilize around 8,000 years ago. The great forests of the world reached their modern extent. The climate settled into the relatively calm, predictable pattern of the Holocene, the geological epoch that we still live in today. The world, for the first time in 100,000 years, became still. And in that stillness, something new could take root. The constant, desperate pressure of a changing world was lifted. For the first time, humans could stay in one place for more than a generation. They could build something that was meant to last. They could plant a seed and be reasonably certain that they would be there to see it grow. The great thaw did not just melt the glaciers. It created the necessary conditions for the next great transformation in the human story. It laid the groundwork for the invention of agriculture and the birth of the first villages. But that is a story for another time. For now we are left with the echo of the great collapse, a world of ice undone by warmth, a world of giants vanished into memory, and a world of people scattered, traumatized, but relentlessly adaptable, standing on the shore of a new, warmer, and stranger ocean. They were the children of the Great Winter. They had walked through the frozen heart of the world and come out the other side. They had seen their gods die and their ancestral lands drown. They had survived a planetary catastrophe, a change so vast and so violent that it is almost beyond our ability to imagine. And what did they carry with them from that lost world? What stories did the land lost tell their children? About the green country that now lay beneath the waves, what myths did the last mammoth stalkers whisper? About the great shaggy spirits that no longer walked the earth. We cannot know. The thaw washed away not just the ice but the memories of the world that lived beneath it. But we can feel its legacy in the deep archetypal fear of the flood, the great deluge that appears in the myths of almost every culture on earth, in the enduring primal comfort of the fire, and in the quiet, resilient and unbreakable strand of our own DNA, a thread of memory that connects us all, back to the small band of survivors who stood blinking in the light of a new sun on the first day of a world reborn. The ice was gone. The great mammoths were ghosts. The drowned lands of the coast were now the secret territory of the sea. The world was warm and it was green. But the human mind is not a blank slate. It is a landscape shaped by the pressures of the past, and 100,000 years of ice leaves a deep and lasting impression. The people who walked out of the great thaw were not the same as the people who had walked into it. They were survivors, and they remembered. They did not remember in the way we do. They had no books of history, no geological charts, no graphs of rising sea levels. Their memory was a different kind of thing. A living, breathing memory encoded not in text but in story, in ritual and in the quiet, unspoken rules of a new society. This is the most difficult kind of history to uncover. It leaves no fossils. It leaves no tools. It is the archaeology of the soul. But we can see its shadow in the patterns of the cultures that were born in the wake of the ice. Consider the great flood myths. They are found everywhere. In the story of Noah from the ancient Near East, in the tale of Manu from India, in the Greek myth of Deucalion, and in the legends of the Anishinaabe people of North America, the Maya of Mesoamerica, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. Across continents, Across cultures separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, the story is the same. A great world-ending flood, a handful of human survivors, and a world reborn from the water. Where did this story come from? Is it just a coincidence, a universal human fear of the power of water? Or is it a memory, a distant, distorted, and mythologized echo of a real event, a memory of the great thaw? A memory of the 8,000 years when the sea levels rose by over 100 meters and the world of their ancestors literally drowned. For the land-lost people of Dogland or the coastal peoples of the Sunda Shelf, the flood was not a myth. It was the lived experience of generations. They were the survivors, and they would have carried the story with them as they retreated inland. The story of the great water that swallowed the world of the ancestors. A story so powerful, so traumatic, so fundamental to their new identity that it was told and retold until it became the founding myth of a new world. A world that began with a flood. This is not proof. It is a ghost of a possibility, but it is a powerful one. It suggests that our oldest and most universal stories may not be works of pure imagination. They may be a form of geology, a form of climatology, a memory of the ice passed down through 1,000 generations until the facts were forgotten and only the feeling remained. And it was not just the memory of the water, it was the memory of the giants. The people who survived the thaw were the children of the great Megapora extinction. They had lived through the passing of the mammoths, the rhinos, the great lions. Their entire world, the spiritual and physical center of their universe, had vanished. How does a culture process such a profound loss? How do you explain a world where your gods have died? Perhaps you tell stories of a previous age, a great glorious time when giant beings walked the earth, a time of heroes and monsters, a time that was lost. Look at the myths of the world. How many of them speak of a golden age, an ancient lost epoch when the world was different, when giants and gods and monsters were real, the titans of Greek mythology, the Jotun of Norse legend, the great beasts of the Dreamtime in Australia. These are not just fantasies. They are a way of structuring time, a way of saying the world we live in now is a lesser world than the one that came before. Is it possible that these two are an echo of the ice? A memory of the Mammoth Steppe, a mythologized account of a world that was truly literally inhabited by giants. The art of the caves, the great paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet stopped as the ice retreated, but the memory of the animals in them did not. The image of the bull, the lion, the great stag. These became the central figures in the cosmologies of the New World. They became the symbols of power, of ferocity, of the wild, untamable spirit of a world that was now gone. They became the first gods, born not of creation but of extinction. And the memory of the ice shaped not just their stories but their societies. The people who survived were the ones who had learned the hard lessons of the cold, the importance of cooperation, the necessity of sharing, the value of a community that could hold together through the leanest of times. The hunter-gatherer societies that emerged after the thaw. The cultures of the Mesolithic were often fiercely egalitarian. They had no chiefs, no kings, no priests. Leadership was fluid, based on skill and wisdom, not on birthright or accumulated wealth. Food was shared. Resources were held in common. Was this a memory of the hunt? A social structure born from the absolute necessity of working together to bring down a giant and the absolute necessity of sharing it so that everyone could survive. The mammoth, even in its absence, was still teaching them how to be human. And then there was the memory of the trauma itself. 100,000 years of relentless existential pressure, of cold, of hunger, of a world that was constantly changing beneath their feet. What does that do to the mind of a species? Perhaps it creates a deep archetypal anxiety. A feeling that the world is not stable, that the warmth and the green are not a promise but a temporary gift. A fear that the winter, the great winter, could one day return. This is the anxiety that sits at the heart of so many creation myths. The idea that our world is a fragile, precious thing built on the ruins of a previous world that was destroyed. The idea that we are living in a borrowed time, a brief, warm summer between two endless winters. This memory of instability of a world that can be unmade in a single lifetime may have been one of the great psychological drivers of what came next. It may be the reason why, when the climate of the Holene finally did stabilize, some humans felt a deep primal urge to build something that would last, something that could withstand the next flood, the next winter, the next great forgetting. This is the quiet anxiety that may have fueled the birth of agriculture. The desire not just to find food but to control it, to plant a seed in the earth, was to make a wager against the chaos of the world. It was an act of faith, but it was also an act of fear. A fear born from the memory of a time when the food simply vanished. The first farmers were the direct descendants of the survivors. They were the people who carried the stories of the drowned lands and the vanished giants. And when they built the first permanent villages, when they raised the first stone walls and dug the first granaries, were not just building a new way of life. They were building a fortress against the memory of the ice. We see this pattern in the very first monuments they created. At Göbekli, in what is now Turkey, hunter-gatherers on the very cusp of the agricultural revolution built a great temple of stone 11,500 years ago. They carved it with images of the animals of their world, the predators, the scavengers, the powerful spirits of a wild that was already beginning to feel threatened. Was this temple a celebration of the new world, or was it a memorial to the old one? A desperate attempt to hold on to the animal spirits as the world of the hunt gave way to the world of the harvest. A place to remember, and the memory was encoded not just in stone but in the body itself. The genetics of modern humans tell a story of survival. The populations that made it through the ice were not a random sample. They were the ones with the adaptations for the cold metabolisms that could efficiently store fat, circulatory systems that could protect the extremities from frostbite, immune systems that could withstand the pathogens of a crowded, smoky winter shelter. These are the genes that were passed down, the biological memory of the great winter, and many of us still carry them today. The tendency for our bodies to cling to fat, to crave sugar and salt. This is not a modern malfunction. It is an ancient survival strategy, a genetic echo of a time when a layer of fat was the difference between life and death. Our bodies are still living in the Ice Age. They are still preparing for a winter that may never come. And so the memory of the ice is not a single story. It is 1,000 stories woven together into the fabric of our cultures, our myths, and our very selves. It is the story of the flood that unmade the world. It is the story of the giants who walked in a lost golden age. It is the story of a society built on the principles of the hunt. It is the story of a deep anxiety about the stability of the world. And it is the story of a body that has not forgotten the cold. The survivors did not just walk out of the ice. They carried the ice with them into the new green world that awaited. But perhaps the most profound memory of all was not one of trauma, but one of resilience. The people who survived the Ice Age did not do so because they were the strongest or the fastest or the most brutal. They survived because they were the most creative, the most adaptable, the most social. They were the people who had invented the needle, the boat, the spur thrower. They were the people who had learned to build homes from the bones of the dead. They were the people who had crawled into the darkness to paint their souls onto the walls of the earth. They were the people who had learned to bind their small, fragile communities together with the powerful threads of story, of art, and of ritual. The Ice Age was a crucible. It burned away everything that was not essential. And what remained was a creature that had learned that the greatest tool for survival was not a sharpened stone. It was a shared memory, a shared culture, a shared story. This was the great lesson of the cold. And it was a lesson they would never forget. The cultures that emerged after the thaw were built upon this foundation. The explosion of creativity in the Mesolithic, the invention of agriculture in the Neolithic, the rise of the first cities. All of it was powered by this new supercharged capacity for shared learning and collective action. A capacity that had been forged in the long, dark winter of the world. And so the ice did not break us, it made us. It was the great grinding filter of our history. The pressure that transformed a clever tropical ape into a creature that could live anywhere and dream of anything. It taught us that the world is not stable. But it also taught us that we are. It taught us that when the land drowns, we can learn to sail. When the giants vanish, we can learn to hunt the deer. And when the darkness falls, we can learn to make our own light. We are the children of the survivors, and we have never stopped surviving. We have never stopped adapting. We have never stopped telling stories about the world that was and the world that could be. So when we look back at the great silent expanse of the Ice Age, we should not see a void. We should not see a primitive, brutal world of simple survival. We should see a classroom, a place where our ancestors learned the hardest and most important lessons of all. And we should feel a quiet sense of gratitude, because everything we are, everything we have built, every story we tell, every song we sing was born in the shadow of the ice. It was born in the memory of a world without summer and in the quiet, stubborn resilience of the people who remembered how to find the warmth. The ice is a long way away now. It is a ghost, a story, a series of lines on a geological chart. We live in warmth. We live in a world of soft beds and electric lights and thermostats that hold the winter at bay with the flick of a switch. The great mammoths are gone. The sound of the glacier grinding forward is a silence we will never know. The long, desperate hunt for calories has been replaced by the quiet hum of a refrigerator. It is easy to believe that we have escaped, that we are a new kind of human, a creature of the Holene, this long, gentle summer of the world. It is easy to believe that the Ice Age is a closed chapter, a story that happened to someone else. But it is not. The ice is not just a story. It is a memory. And it does not just live in our books. It lives in our bodies. It is written in the code of our DNA, in the architecture of our minds, and in the strange ancient longings of our hearts. You right now listening to this story are a survivor of the Ice Age, and you carry the memory of the ice in your bones. Consider your own body, the way it responds to the world. When you are cold, you shiver. Your muscles contract in a rapid, involuntary rhythm. This is not a malfunction. It is a memory. A memory of a time when shivering was the body's last desperate attempt to generate its own internal heat to fight back against the killing cold. Your ancestors were the ones who shivered best. When you are stressed or afraid, your body is flooded with cortisol. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, your digestive system shuts down. You are preparing to fight or to flee. This is the same physiological response that your ancestor, the mammoth stalker, would have felt standing before a 6-ton beast. The difference is that their threat was real and it was temporary. Our modern world with its constant low-grade abstract anxieties triggers this ancient survival circuit and never turns it off. The anxiety you feel is not a weakness. It is the echo of a body that is still faithfully trying to keep you alive in a world of giants. And what about the food you crave? The deep, satisfying comfort of fat, of salt, of sugar. These are not modern cravings. They are the cravings of the ice. For 100,000 years, these were the rarest and most precious resources in the world. Fat was the fuel for the long winter. Sugar from a rare piece of summer fruit was a burst of life-saving energy. Salt was a vital mineral hard to find on the inland steppe. Our brains are hardwired to release a powerful surge of dopamine, a feeling of intense pleasure and reward when we consume these things. This is not a flaw in your design. It is a feature designed for a world of scarcity that is now lost in a world of abundance. Your body is still acting like a hunter-gatherer feasting before a long, hard winter, even if that winter will never arrive. And the memory is not just in your biology, it is in your psychology. It is in the very shape of your soul. Why do we find such deep primal comfort in the sight of a fire? Why on a cold, dark night does the simple act of sitting around a campfire or even lighting a few candles feel so profoundly right, so safe? It is because for our species, the fire is more than just a source of warmth. It is a memory of community, a memory of the circle, a memory of the hearth in the mammoth bone hut, the one small point of light and safety in a vast frozen universe of darkness and danger. The flickering light, the crackling sound, these are ancient signals to our nervous system. They are signals that say, you are not alone. The predators are outside. The stories are inside. You can rest now. Our brains are still wired to respond to that signal. The light of a fire triggers a release of oxytocin, the neurochemical of trust and social bonding. It lowers our cortisol levels. It calms our amygdala. It tells the ancient, anxious part of our mind that we are home. And what about our need for story? Why are we the only species on Earth that gets lost in narratives that tells tales of heroes and monsters, of gods and ghosts? Why do we sit here now, you and I, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, sharing this story of the ice? It is because story was the most important survival tool of the Ice Age. It was the technology that allowed a small, physically weak ape to store and transmit the vast amounts of information needed to survive in a complex and hostile world. A story is not just a story. It is a mnemonic device, a piece of code wrapped in emotion that is designed to be remembered and passed down. The story of the foolish hunter who did not respect the spirits of the mammoth was a lesson in ecology. The myth of the Great Flood was a lesson in climatology. The tale of the first firekeeper was a lesson in technology. Our minds did not evolve to remember abstract data. They evolved to remember stories. And our craving for narrative, our deep, insatiable need to understand the world through the lens of a story is the cognitive inheritance of the Ice Age. We are the children of storytellers, and we are still sitting around the fire listening. And finally, there is the memory of the wild, the deep, quiet, and often unsettling part of ourselves that feels a sense of belonging in a world that is not made by human hands. The peace you feel in a deep forest, the awe you feel on a high mountain, the strange, melancholic beauty of a vast, empty landscape. This is not just an aesthetic preference. It is a memory. A memory of a time when the world was not a resource to be managed, but a living, breathing presence to be negotiated with, a world of spirits, of powers, of a great wild and sacred otherness. For 99% of our history, we were not separate from nature. We were a part of it. Our minds were calibrated to its rhythms, its silences, its signs. The feeling of homesickness that we sometimes feel in our modern, sterile, and predictable environments. The vague, unnamed longing for something more, something real. That is the memory of the ice. It is the call of the wild, echoing in the quiet chambers of a mind that has not forgotten where it came from. Our modern world is a marvel of ingenuity, a testament to the incredible power of the mind that was forged in the cold. But it is also a profound mismatch, a mismatch between the ancient Paleolithic hardware of our bodies and minds and the new digital post-industrial software of our culture. And this mismatch is the source of so much of our quiet modern suffering. We are a social tribal primate that now lives in unprecedented isolation. We are a creature of motion that now sits still for 8 hours a day staring at a glowing rectangle. We are a being whose nervous system is designed to respond to the real, tangible threats of the seed wild that is now constantly triggered by the abstract, unending anxieties of the digital world. The loneliness, the anxiety, the burnout, these are not personal failures. They are the predictable symptoms of a creature living outside of its natural habitat. They are the cries of an Ice Age body that is trying its best to survive in a world that no longer makes sense to it. But the memory is not a curse. It is also a guide. It is a compass that points us back toward the things that truly matter, the things that kept us alive and sane through the long, dark winter of the world. Community, connection, purpose, story, and the quiet healing presence of a world that is not made by us. The memory of the ice is a reminder that we are not machines. We are animals, ancient, clever, and deeply social animals. And we still need the things that our ancestors needed. We still need our tribe. We still need a fire to sit around. And we still need a story to tell in the dark. This is not a call to return to the past. We cannot go back to the world of the Mammoth Steppe, and we would not want to. It was a world of incredible hardship, of constant danger, of a life that was often short and brutal. But it was also a world of incredible beauty, of profound connection, and of a quiet, hard-won wisdom. And we can choose to remember that wisdom. We can choose to listen to the echo of the ice in our bones. We can choose to build our modern world in a way that honors our ancient design. To create communities that feel like tribes. To find rituals that feel like firelight. To tell stories that feel true. To find a way to live in this new warm world without forgetting the lessons of the cold. Because the ice may have melted from the land, but it will never melt from our memory. It is the foundation on which we are built. It is the great silent and frozen river that still flows deep within us. And perhaps that is the final and most enduring legacy of the great winter. It was the force that made us human. But it is also the memory that reminds us of what being human means. It means that we are fragile, that our warmth is a precious and temporary thing in a universe that is vast and cold and silent. It means that we are dependent, that we cannot survive alone, that our greatest strength is not in our claws or our teeth, but in our ability to trust each other, to share our food, to tell our stories. And it means that we are resilient, that even in the deepest, darkest, and coldest of nights, we have the capacity to create our own light, to find a way not just to endure, but to find meaning, to find beauty, to crawl into the belly of the earth and paint the souls of animals onto the walls, to carve the mystery of life into a piece of bone, to fill the endless silence